If you grew up in the United States, you probably know the scoring rules for American football by heart. A touchdown is always worth 6 points. The point after touchdown is worth 1 point if you kick it. You can get 2 points if you decide not to kick it.
Being chased, swings it over to Anderson. Can they stop him?
A safety is worth 2 points. And of course, a field goal is worth 3 points. So the currency of football scoring is really etched into our heads. It's hard to imagine things ever being different, and that's why many of us will feel a little bit awkward when we finally learn that the scoring system actually used to be different. In fact, it used to be a lot different. Okay, first things first, football wasn't always football. What I mean here is that the sport of college football didn't always follow the distinct American rules. If you were going to go back to watch Princeton and Rutgers play in November 1869, you would feel like you were watching a game of rugby. That's because they were playing rugby. Before Walter Camp came along to change things, American football was rugby. In fact, a lot of sports originally came from rugby and the other schoolyard games of English football in the early 19th century. It was Camp who decided to create the scrimmage system, started counting times tackled, or downs, and started making rules about advancing the ball a certain number of yards to get a new set of downs. Now, back in 1880, there was only one way to score, and no, it didn't come from taking the ball over the goal line. The phrase touchdown is in the old rugby rules, but it refers to something different. If you scored a touchdown in those days, you had to place the ball down on the ground once you crossed the goal line. You would then be able to take a free kick from a point parallel to the point you put the ball down. This was called a try, which is still the name in rugby. If that kick went through the uprights, you would get 1 point. Now, if you look at a diagram of the field, it becomes obvious that you wanted to put the ball as close to the center as possible. If you weren't able to, though, you could do what they called a punt out, or a punt from the end zone back to the field to try to get your team to catch the ball in a place better suited for a free kick. The wording here in this 1883 rulebook is a bit vague. Basically, your team had to make a fair catch on the punt out to get a free try at goal from the place they caught the fair catch. Alternatively, you could also just take a kick from the field without crossing the goal line, which is why they call it a field goal. Anyway, if you think about it, you'll realize that the touchdown itself was useless. The game was literally nothing but what we now call extra points and I guess field goals back in 1880 and 1881. Sure, in 1881, they decided to make it so that a goal after touchdown was worth more than a field goal from the field if the teams were tied in the end, but that rule rarely came up, if ever. Now, Walter Camp was a fan of law and order, and he knew that it wasn't going to work to only have one way of scoring. He worked through a few different scoring rules in 1883 before finally coming up with a scheme he liked. Under Camp's rules, a touchdown counted as 4 points even if the team missed the try or conversion that came afterwards. That goal after touchdown was worth 2 points. A goal successfully kicked from the field was worth 5 points. And a safety, bringing the opponent down with the ball in their own end zone, was worth 2 points. The evolution of the safety rule itself probably needs its own video, but let me at least explain to you how this worked back in the really old days. Oh, and thanks on this part to the Football Archaeology blog on Substack for helping clarify this rule for me. What we know of as a safety was originally called either a minor or a rogue in rugby back in the 1870s. This gave a point to the defending team. However, in the early version of American football, no point was awarded to the other team. Instead, the team taking the ball past their own goal line could take it out to the 25-yard line and kick it to the other team, or they could hold on to the ball and run another offensive play from the 25-yard line. That's why it was called a safety touchdown or just a safety. It was playing it safe. It was actually an offensive weapon in the early 1880s since you could get a free kick from taking the ball down in your own end zone without any negative consequences at all. If you read accounts of games from the early 1880s, you'll realize really quickly that the safety was used way too often, which is why Camp decided that it needed to become a way for the defense to score points. The other thing to note is that a field goal was technically worth more than a touchdown. There was this constant quarreling back in those days about whether there was too much kicking in the sport or not enough kicking. They changed the rules in 1897 to make touchdowns worth 5 points. The conversion afterwards was changed to 1 point. In hindsight, this discussion is actually really interesting, and it included people who proposed removing the point after touchdown altogether. Removing the extra point would have been kind of radical, believe it or not. I mean, that was the one major tie that American football still had with the old rugby game, because as you remember, the extra point was the try. It was the only point. Anyway, that's why the extra point is still around to this day. The truth is that for years there were articles at the end of every summer in the newspapers about potential modifications to the rules of the sport. In theory, all the tinkering was supposed to be done to make the game somehow safer. In practice, the sport slowly de-emphasized the kicking game and put more emphasis on scoring touchdowns. Back in 1904, the field goal went down in value from 5 points to 4, largely to diminish it as an offensive weapon. There was also some talk back then about moving the uprights back to the end of the end zone to make it harder to kick a field goal because they were at the front of the end zone back in those days. That did happen, but it took decades. Though it's mostly forgotten today, this was really widely discussed in the media in 1904. Now, as you probably already know, the forward pass was finally made legal in 1906, though it wasn't attempted all that often. In general, it seemed that the public favored a more wide-open game and fewer runs straight up the middle. And, in general, it seems that people felt that there were too many field goals being scored, leading to games that were boring. So, in 1909, the value of a field goal went down to 3 points, which is where it's been ever since. And finally, the touchdown was bumped up to 6 points in 1912. Of course, they didn't do anything about the point after touchdown, which now seemed kind of superfluous, and the press really let them know about it. Now, all this changing around meant that football scores from the old days look really odd to us today. You could have 1-0 games back in the 1880s, for example, with touchdowns and field goals sometimes worth 5 points each and sometimes worth 4 points each. It's not so easy to look at an old score and figure out exactly what happened. And it wasn't really until after World War I was over that everybody settled down and stopped with all of the constant scoring rule changes. Another thing that might surprise you is that the 2-point conversion after touchdown wasn't part of the college football rules until 1958. As you can imagine, this was controversial when it came around. In fact, the idea was originally voted down, though it was able to overcome those initial obstacles. There were concerns from the beginning that it put the game out of balance. In the end, though, it was popular enough to stay on. The American Football League started using the 2-point conversion rule in 1960, which helped the concept grow in popularity. But of course, it wasn't until 1994 that the NFL, the old no-fun league, finally got with the times and adopted the 2-point conversion. And even then, it was controversial. Well, and there you have it. It turns out the football scoring rules have changed quite a bit over the years. And the amazing thing is that the extra point, which has been much maligned, is still a part of the sport to this day, despite all of the attempts to get rid of it. Now, as you can imagine, all these basic rule changes create headaches for people who want to mess around with cross-era play in football. To my knowledge, none of the major football simulation games even dare touch seasons from 1912 or earlier. A big part of the problem is the lack of useful statistics. In fact, it can be hard to find simple rosters for teams from back then. But when you're talking about a sport where the basic scoring system has changed so dramatically, making comparisons is probably impossible. Well, sure, teams are bigger, faster, and stronger these days, and sure, play calling and basic strategies have come a long way in the last 150 years or so, but I've always wondered what the sport would be like if scoring rules went back to the way that things once were. Would we care so much about quarterbacks, or would we go around wearing the jerseys of the field goal kickers? What do you think?